Hello, everyone. We are in chapter 11, where we will discuss multiple classes and inheritance. So what that means is, so far you've been developing your programs and creating a form and having um, one class that you're writing code for, but now you will now allow your program to have multiple classes and allow other classes to inherit from your main class, or if I should say your super class, which we will talk about a little bit more as we move forward. So for this particular chapter, what's different is a mask text box that you will actually use to enter the student ID number, and we'll continue using combo boxes and text boxes, okay? And we will also briefly discuss the three-tiered program structure that most of your programs have been following, and now you're having a better idea of what you've been creating and going about it. This is just giving a little bit more information as to what we'll be creating inside of the program. You will now create a class constructor, which will basically instantiate all the objects that you will be using and passing and the values that you'll be passing to it. So we'll get into all that a little bit more. Another thing we'll look at is overridable procedures. So what that means is maybe in your base class or your super class, which is the main one where you're going to begin with, maybe it has procedures inside of it that you want to use in your subclass, which is subclass is a class that has inherited from your base class. So it inherits all the attributes, which are instance variables and procedures. But maybe that particular procedure that's inside of the base class doesn't quite do everything that you need it to do. So you want to override it and add another task to it or change or modify it a bit. So that's you overriding the original, okay? So we'll get into that a little bit more. Also, this time you will create a text file. So before last chapter, well, chapter 8, when you were dealing with arrays, you were reading a text file. So you was reading the data in your text file and retrieving it from the text file and putting it into your arrays. But now what we'll do is now write to a text file. So now you'll be sending information to a text file. So that's what will be different for this particular chapter. All right, so this is the form that we'll be creating for this particular guided portion. And what it is basically, as you see, college registration. So now you're going to have a main form that will allow students to register for their classes for a particular college. It'll use a mask text box for them to enter their student ID number, a text box to enter their name, a text box for them to enter the number of units they want to take. Here, whether or not they want to stay on campus or off campus, these are radio buttons. And then housing, which dormitory or they would like to stay in, which residence they will choose to stay in if they decide to stay on campus. Major, what their major will be. And then we're gonna set it up to calculate the cost, because remember, on and off campus students will pay different price. So off campus wouldn't have to pay for housing or board. So their cost to attend would be different from anyone that's on campus. So that means whenever one of the students select on campus, now the housing board will appear, and then they are able to select which housing that they would like to live in while they're on campus, okay? And then they still can enter their major. All right, and then once they make their selection, based on all their selections, now their calculated cost will be whatever is placed here. Because remember, it's taking into account how many units they're taking as well, which we'll go over that a little bit more. But just to kind of see the different things that's happening and how the inheritance is going to work as we're moving forward, because even though they're all students that are registering, all of them have different criteria that they're meeting. So you have some that are on campus, and then you have some that are off campus. So it'll be different questions or different costs that'll be generated for them both. So that's why you have to be able to differentiate whenever you are creating multiple classes. So here you can just read more about the different objects that we'll be using to retrieve information from the user. You'll notice that for the number of units, it's going to make sure that they enter a number between 1 to 24, so nothing less, nothing more. Okay. So here, when you're looking at the student ID, what I want you to remember is that when they're entering values inside of that, it's just going to check to make sure those values are numeric and that they've entered all 9 digits. So it's just going to make sure they enter 9 digits and that it's numeric. It's not necessarily where it won't be visible or anything like that. Okay. We're going to look at this code a little bit more, but this is just seeing how it's validating the information that the user is entering. We'll look at that more in the code window, but I just wanted to make sure I walk through a couple things that that's in your slides. Now, as mentioned, the program structure, as far as when you're creating, here you have your presentation tier where you're creating your user interface, creating your forms, which is what you've been doing thus far. Your logic and calculations will be the business tier where you're now calculating whatever it is that you need to calculate and determining what you need your program to do. Your persistence tier is data storage, files and databases. So it's similar to what you were dealing with when you were completing chapter 10, the databases, where you're now generating a complete form that includes the data from a database, and now you have a whole complete different type of form that has been generated. And also for this particular chapter, what you're going to generate as each time a person registers, is going to actually print their information to a text file, which is how companies keep track of certain information that they are retrieving from every student that decides to apply. Okay, this just goes into more detail about the program structure. So this is just letting you know the forms that we'll be creating. So the form college, the one that we were looking at, the main form is our presentation tier, where it's going to be a form object that we're going to add all the different objects to it. The business tier is now we're going to create 2 classes that's going to inherit from this main form. You're going to have an on-campus student, right? And then you're going to have an off-campus student, all right? And then persistence here is, as I mentioned, is that file that's going to be generated, which is going to write all the information to a file. So now if a person wanted to gather a report and print everything, all the people that have registered, they could do that. We're gonna keep going. Now, we've already gone through creating objects of classes. So that's what you did with your chapter 8. I don't know if you guys recall when you created 2 forms, and whenever you wanted certain things to happen, you created an object of the second form, of your previous first form, so that it can actually perform what you wanted it to do. All right, so the same thing here. Now, when you're creating your form, and if you want you want to access anything inside of the class, whatever class you created, you have to create an object of that class, so that now you can access whatever it is that's inside of that particular class, which we'll walk through it a little bit more as we're looking at the code. But I want you to have a good idea of what we're setting up. Now, because you're using multiple classes, when you're creating these classes, you're gonna also have a constructor. And basically, this constructor is going to instantiate whatever objects you're going to be passing and whatever objects you're going to be using. So it's basically going to prepare those objects to receive information, to basically do whatever it is you need it to do, all right? This is the syntax for your sub procedure. So sub, new, and then in sub. So whatever is on the inside is what you will be instantiating, which we will talk about that and see it in actual code, okay? But this is the syntax for your constructor. All right, so this is just showing how you're instantiating your object. Remember, we just created an object of the student class. So here, object student is the name of the object that we've given it. We're creating an object of the student class, and now we're instantiating the different arguments that we're gonna pass. So basically whatever's in the text box that they entered for their student ID, whatever they entered for their student name, whatever they entered for or selected for their major, and also however many units. So now each student has this information. So now you're gonna retrieve that information for each student, okay? And notice here, your constructor here, your constructor here and how it is basically written. Sub, new, and now you're passing it in that appropriate order. So now you're passing an object that will hold that information. So remember, you can pass by val or pass by reference. In this case, we're just passing the actual argument that that the user has entered. So of course, we're not going to keep anything, or in this case, we're just passing. All right, we're just processing this information. So now we're going to pass whatever the user entered in text box will now be stored in string student ID. Whatever they entered in name will now be stored in this object. And then whatever they selected as their major will now be stored in string major, okay? And notice, just to be clear, notice that combo major, it says selected item. So it's gonna retrieve whatever they selected. So if they selected computer science, if they selected mathematics as their major, it's gonna select the string, the actual item, not the index. Remember, selected index is the actual number of where it's actually located. So make sure you're catching the key difference, and that's why it's gonna be stored in a string here. And then number of units, however many units they have entered in the text box. Remember, text box always returns everything as a string. So that's why this is going to be a string. Of course, we will convert it at some point, but right now, this is how it's being retrieved and stored, and then we'll process it after the fact. This is in your code. I'm gonna walk you through the full code. I've already typed it up, so that won't take a whole lot of the time. I just wanna make sure you're understanding what you're looking at. All right, so this is inheritance. So notice here, when I mentioned, you're gonna have your super class, which is your base class, your main class. So mainly we have a class called student, and each of the students have an ID, a name, number of units, and a major. So all this is related to each student. No matter what, each of the students will have that, okay? So now, because we're dealing with two types of students, on campus and off campus. So now different procedures will be needed for those particular students. So they need to be separate classes. So now I need to have an on-campus student class, and I need to have a off-campus student class, right? Now, on-campus student class is now considered a subclass because it has inherited all these attributes. So it has inherited student ID, student name, student unit, student major. So an on-campus student can also now have all this information, but because the student is on campus, in addition to that information, they need a list of residence halls that they can select. So whichever one that they select, that will be pertaining to them as well. So on-campus student is a subclass of this base class. So now, this is where the object-oriented portion comes from, all right? So now you're creating an on-campus student, and when you're basically processing it, you're gonna have to create an object of that particular class, and which we'll get into that. All right, so we're just looking at inheritance, and we'll look at that a little bit more as we're looking at the code, okay? But for the most part, just looking at here, this is your main class student here. And this is all the information pertaining to them, all right? So notice what we're creating here in addition to, because what we're presenting in the end is the actual cost that they will have to pay. So in order for us to calculate the cost, we have to include how much they have to pay per unit, which is the cost per unit here, and then decimal cost, which is gonna basically hold a total cost for that student to attend that institution, okay? And then this is us creating, we'll get into that. Don't stress about that, we'll get into that. All right, so now we're looking at inheritance. Now that we've seen here what's inside of student, now we're ready to allow our on-campus student to inherit. So notice here, this is a brand new class that we're creating, on-campus student, and we're telling it is going to inherit everything, all the variables inside of student. All right, so now on-campus student has now inherited all these different variables here, okay? And in addition to those variables, we're including these variables, which is gonna allow the user to select, and notice it's Boolean. So now it's gonna determine which radio button they selected. If they select to stay in Cooper or Craig or Julian, that's gonna indicate which dormitory or which residence hall they will live in. Now, the key is, because now we've used inheritance for the on-campus student, I don't have to retype all these variables. It has already been inherited just by me saying inherit here. So now they have all these variables in addition to these variables that we're adding to it, okay? So now on-campus student now have their residence where they can select where they want to live, and also student ID, name, number of units, and major, okay? That's the great thing about inheritance, okay? Now this is your base class. Remember, base class is your super class, your main class. So this is the constructor for your main class. So notice we looked at that in a couple slides back. Oh, sorry. Where we're passing each value. And remember, there has to be in the order. So this is setting your program up to receive those values. So that means anytime a user enters that information, now it's setting us up to pass the information and process it the way we want to process it, okay? So now once we pass the information, now it's being instantiated. So notice here, student ID will equal whatever that, because remember, these are class level. That's why these are listed here. These are all class level. So you remember, when it's class level, you can use it anywhere inside of your program. So student, string student ID is the student ID class variable that is gonna hold whatever's the student ID, all right? And then name, whatever their name, and then major. And remember, I told you units will be as a string. So because we are now ready to convert it, we're ready to convert it to an integer, okay? So now we're ready to take int units and convert it because it's being stored as a string originally because of what we retrieved from the text box, okay? Now this is your subclass constructor. So remember, your subclass, which was the on-campus student, it had way more information, right? So it also had the student ID, student name, number of units, but it also had whether or not they will, which dormitory they could live in. So now you're instantiating this particular subclass. And so let's back up a little bit. You're instantiating this subclass so that the person that is going to be an on-campus student can enter all their student information, and also whether or not they decide they want to stay in which residence hall, okay? And so this is the constructor for that, where you're instantiating and preparing it. And the reason you're doing that is because now whoever enters their information, they can all use it. So this is kind of like a template behind the scene that's processing all the information. So every student, on-campus student, can use this as long as they're putting in their information, okay? And then my base.new. So here, when you're looking at this portion here, student ID, student name, major units, this is all from your base class, all right? So now you're setting up the constructor to make sure that you're instantiating the argument. So every value that was being used. So my base, which is my base class, new, which is just basically looking at it from the constructor standpoint. Let's go back here. And you notice here, I don't want to go too far. Yeah. So you notice here the student ID, student names, and major and units were the main here that was in, that's going to be inside the students that you're instantiating. So that is why student ID, student name, major, and units are the values that's being passed. Okay. And if this helps a little bit, this is your base class constructor, which is only expecting student ID, student name, major, and unit. So that's what you are sending it. So even though the on-campus student has all these values here, we're passing it, but now we're storing it in its appropriate place. So we're passing it to our base class new, the student ID, student name, major, and units, what's supposed to be there. And then inside of this particular class, we are now instantiating our values, Cooper, Craig, or Julie. If they selected Cooper, it's going to store true. If they didn't select Craig, it's going to store false, and Julian will store false. So now we're instantiating and filling those variables with its appropriate value, okay? This is just more details about inheritance and procedures, how we're going to look at that, okay? And as I mentioned, base class is going to have a procedure and you can override them, and we'll look at that a little bit more, okay? Now, in the base class, we're saying that, and notice that notice the terms that are being used. So this is an object of the subclass, this is an object of the base class. So you have to remember, you have to create an object of the class that you're wanting to use, whose procedures you're wanting to use, okay? And then we have this message box. This is just showing you the use of the actual function. And this one is called a function because it's, I hope you guys remember, it means it's returning a value, all right? So this is just basically your regular function here. This is just a name that's being used to kind of help you understand what's happening. So this is not an actual function name. This is just like used as an example. So this is just a regular base function. This is what you begin with. This is the original function. It performs a task and then it's going to return a value. All right. So once it returns the value, notice here that it's being returned here, and then the message box is going to appear, and that's what this statement is going to appear on it. Okay, that's just a basic example here is what's happening with the base class procedure. Now, what you're looking at now is saying that maybe I want to override that. Okay. So now you have your object base class, which is basically of your base class, and it's calling the overridable class function, right? And you're just putting overridable. And what's going to happen is it's giving a whole different message. All right. So it's just giving a whole different message and gave it a different name and all that. Okay. And then now when you're looking at it from the subclass perspective. So now object subclass is the object, and then you're calling the overridable base class function that you were looking at previously, all right? And now what you want to happen, so you're calling it, and it's gonna return that, all right? And then here, override, here, function, that means now I wanna override whatever the base class function is. I wanna override it, and I want it to return something else, okay? And you'll probably get it a little bit more once we start plugging in actual procedures and different things like that. And here, this is just calling a regular function procedure in the subclass. So here, object subclass, which is basically an object of your subclass, and we're just calling the regular function that you created, because you can also, get this, you can also create procedures inside of your subclass, all right? That can be in addition to. It doesn't have to just consist of overridable procedures. You can also create your very own procedures and inside of the subclass, all right? So you can have in addition to whatever you inherited from the base class, okay? So here, just again, subclass, it can also call the regular base class function. It doesn't always have to make changes to it. It can use that particular, maybe whatever was created in the original class is gonna work and you wanna just use whatever it is. You can totally do that. This just goes into the persistence tier where we're gonna generate a file. So this is your student cost file class that we're gonna create. And notice that these are all the class level variables that it's going to be using. And this is the only data that you want printed to the actual text file. So it's gonna print the student ID, the student's name, their major, and how much they'll have to pay. All right, and we'll look at all that shortly. And this is what the text file is generating: student ID, their name, their major, and how much they have to pay. All right, and then here's the next student, the next student, the next student. And I'll walk you through that inside of the code window. Okay. All right, so let's go over here to where you'll be creating your guided portion. I can close that. So this is the form that you'll be creating. One thing I want to point out, make sure you select the appropriate text, but this is not just a regular text box. This is a mask, all right? So we'll come over here just to make sure where are all your forms. All right, so make sure you're not selecting text box for that one. Excuse me. You will use the mask text box. Please select the appropriate one so that when you're writing the code for it, it works properly. All right. Sorry, grab some water. All right. And then the rest you should be used to. Remember, you're gonna group these. This combo box is gonna group these radio buttons. All right. So that they can select what they like. All right. All right. So now let's move over here. Form college. This is the main college form. So this is this code. So if I double click this, it's going to take me into this window. And this is the code for this particular form. All right. And notice this particular form is holding the calculate cost button. So whenever the calculate cost button happens, this is what's going to take place. So basically, it's going to create an object of student class, which we're going to look at student class in a second. It also creates an object of on-campus student, right? And then an input error, which is basically just going to make sure that the user has input all the correct information, all right? So the very first thing it's going to do is check the math score to make sure that the student entered the appropriate number of digits. So if they didn't, of course, it's going to let you know that this is an error, and it's going to clear out and allow them to do it again. All right, and then it's going to update input error to true because they didn't put in the appropriate information. Here is going to make sure that the user actually put in a full name. So now we're just going to make sure that that they didn't have anything, they didn't leave it blank, or they didn't put anything in there that wasn't pertaining to a name, that wouldn't be recognized as a name. So if that's incorrect, same thing is going to happen. Give a message box, clear everything out, set input error to true, so they got to do it again. So the text for the text box for the numeric, now here is going to check to see if whatever they entered in the text box is a numeric value. So it's going to check to make sure it's numeric, all right? And then here is also going to take the value and convert it. So it's gonna convert it to an integer, all right? So basically what's gonna happen, and this one is just gonna check to make sure that, so let's just say this. If the value that the user entered, all right, is not numeric and it returns true, all right? So now what happens is the value isn't numeric, so whatever they entered is not numeric, so it's gonna return true, no, not numeric. So what happens is it makes it now, it's going to negate it and cause it to print the, enter the number of units and have them do it over again, okay? So now, however, if the value is numeric and it's okay, so what's, I mean, if it is actually okay and not a symbol or anything like that, now it's gonna take the value and convert it to an integer. And it's gonna also check to make sure that the values are not less than 1 or greater than 24. So it's gonna make sure that it's within the 1 to 24 range that we discussed previously. Also, the combo box, the major selection is gonna make sure that they made a selection. If they make a selection, it's gonna be 0 and higher up to whatever, however many items is in it. But if it's less than 0, that means they didn't make a selection. So it's gonna validate that as well. And then now it's checking the radio button to see if the user selected, what did they select? So if they check the off-campus, then here they're only gonna just use new student. They're just gonna be a new student in this case, all right? So everything pertaining to this student is just what's in the new student, okay? However, if they did not check the off-campus and they checked on-campus, that means now this is an on-campus student. So now you create an object of the on-campus student. So now they will include all this information that we discussed previously, student ID, name, major, units, and dormitory, okay? And then it's gonna print their total cost based on what their selections were. And same thing here, if they're an on-campus student, they are, I mean, an off-campus student, then this is what their cost would be. So notice there are different costs being generated, all right? So here what you have, radio off-campus button. So you just basically, if the user is off-campus, then the group, the housing should not appear, all right? If they're on campus, then the housing should appear, is basically what's happening, okay? So when the form loads, this will only appear if they click on campus, all right? So this wouldn't be here when it loads. They click on campus and that's what they'll end up. That means they're gonna stay on campus, okay? And then clear is just basically as normal, it just clears everything out. Now, notice here where we're creating new classes. So if you notice in this place, when you're over here in your form and you right click in this case, what you're gonna do is you're basically going to be creating a new class. And I don't wanna create anything new because I don't wanna mess it up so that you'll see, but just know that when you're creating here, and this is just me clicking on stuff, you'll notice that you're able to create new things over here, add a class and all of that. All right, so make sure you're following your steps. But what I want to look at is each one individually that you're creating. So now you have 3 different classes that are inheriting from each other, like inheriting from your main class student. All right, so let's start with student. So here, notice that this one doesn't have a form. Notice neither of these have a form related to them. They're just classes. They're just class of data. I mean, of code that has been written to perform a task, all right? So here we're creating student, and notice as we saw before, it has the number, the item, ID, and student name, major, and all of that. And then you're also creating an object of the student cost file, which is going to be the class that's going to generate the text file. So you need a connection to that class so that any student that is registering will be printed to that text file. And then notice here, we now have our subnew. This is our constructor here, which is basically instantiating it to have these values as we discussed previously, these instance variables that has been created here. All right, these are your instance variables. So it's ready. All right. And then here you're converting a unit. So we kind of went through the constructor already, but this is where the constructor is. Generally, in most of your coding classes, you'll notice that the constructor is usually at the very beginning, right after the instance variables, which will be, these will be your class instance, your instance variables. And now you have an overridable function, which means this is your main class, but this function can be overridable. That's going to compute cost because it's going to be different. It's going to be different for on-campus students. So it always won't be the same thing. All right. So this overridable function here is going to return the cost. All right. And the name of it is compute cost. So now you're going to calculate the cost for the student that's going to stay off campus, however many units they're taking times however the cost per unit, which is $450, I think. Yeah, $450 here. And then now you're creating so you're using your object that you created of the student cost file, and you're telling it to send this information for just a student that is not staying on campus. This is just a regular student. So their ID, their name, their major, and the cost for their attendance is now being sent to the student cost file. All right. And now you're telling it to write the record. All right. So object student cost file write record, which is basically a method that has, a procedure that has been created that's going to write the information to the text file. And I'm going to go there and show you that in a second. But it'll also return the cost of this particular student. So when it's returning the cost, it's basically returning it so that it'll print to the label, all right? Which we'll look at that in a second, but just to make sure that you're seeing what write record is. Write record is a procedure inside of object student cost. So let's come here. This is the class here, student cost here, that's going to write to your file. So notice you created it, and it's going to have all this information, student ID, student name. You're gonna pass that information. And the sub procedure is basically instantiating. And so student ID will basically be stored here in this variable that you created to hold it. So as you send this information, the student ID, as you're passing and processing all this information behind the scenes, it's gonna store it. And now you can use these variables that hold this information to do what you want to do. And that's what our write record is doing. So sub write record is a procedure that you have created. This is your procedure that you created, for example. And now you're telling it to create a file called student cost. So this is the name of the file that it's going to create. And now you're telling it to write. So if you remember, we were using stream reader in chapter 8 because we were reading input. We was reading from a text file. But now we're using stream writer because now we're writing to a text file. All right. So you're creating an object of stream writer, right? And now you're telling it to append. So this is just telling it to add this information to this file. So append is going to keep adding on. So it's going to keep the original and keep adding, appending on to that particular file. It's not going to get rid of anything. That's why it's basically appending. And then object write is just basically going to write the information, write the student ID, and notice that concatenation and a comma, right? And then the next thing we want to do is write and the name and a comma, write the major and a comma. And then write line is basically telling it write and then move to the next line. So that means, I closed it, but that means write is gonna write everything on the same line and is not gonna move to the next line. So everything pertaining to this student will be on one line up until it gets to the cost, the last item, the cost, and then it moves to the next line and then it closes, which means now every time a student registers, it's gonna keep appending that information after the other, after it moves to the next line, all right? And it closes it. And notice that it's using a try catch in this situation, just to make sure that they can actually find the, try and actually append to this location. You can actually find this location for it. That's the difference right here. So now you have a try-catch that's going to perform that for you. All right. And one last thing is your on-campus student. So now our on-campus student, which is inheriting from the main student here. So this is us using inheritance. So now you're seeing how you have inheritance here, and now you just have multiple classes. All these are others are just multiple classes. Not necessarily inheriting, but is allowing you to create objects of those classes and process the information, okay? But on-campus student is inheriting from students, so it inherits all the attributes there, and we're creating instance variables inside of this particular subclass, and we're also creating an object of the student cost file because now an on-campus student has applied, and we want to make sure we can send their information as well. So as we saw previously, here we have our constructor here that is passing, instantiating all of that information that we discussed. And because we are because our base class is the one that processes that information, we're now here addressing our base class and its constructor and passing that information from here. So student ID, pass it to my base class constructor. And I just want to point out, it has to go in the right order, okay? So notice student ID here, student name, major, and units. So same thing when you're passing it, ID, student name, major, units has to be in the appropriate order. And now we are instantiating these 3 new ones that we have. So whatever passes, whatever is selected, if Cooper selected, is passes true, Craig false, and Julian false, or vice, however, depends on what they selected. All right. So this is instantiating all of those class level variables. Now, this is why the compute cost was overridable, because although it began in student here as compute cost, notice that a regular student just has to pay for their units because they're not staying on campus. But if they decide to stay on campus, the cost is going to be different. So that's why this function is overridable, because the calculation actually changes. What's inside actually changes, okay? So now they have to include the housing cost, right? And what it costs to stay in each of those dormitories, how much each of one of those costs, right? So now we check to see if they selected Cooper. If they selected Cooper, then they'll have to pay whatever Cooper housing is. If they selected Craig, now they'll have to pay whatever is in whatever Craig costs. If they selected Julian, so notice this if-else statement determines what the housing cost variable will store. And now when calculating the cost, we still do the number of units times the number of units per unit, which is the 490, 450, plus whatever it is they will have to pay in housing costs, okay? That's what's different with the calculation. And then here, object student cost file will basically now create an object of the student cost file and class, and now it's gonna pass this information and write it to our text file, right? Our write record, write all this information to our text file because we're keeping record. And then it's gonna return this cost here so that now it prints to your label, which is here. If you remember, this is where our label here, and notice object on campus student, because if they decide they're on campus, that means they're selecting Julian or one of the housing. So now we're gonna call the compute cost from our on-campus class. All right, so the on-campus object that we created will allow us to access the compute cost inside of that class to calculate the how much they'll have to pay for housing and their number of units. However, on this one, for the off-campus student, we're creating an object of the student, just the student class, and we're using that compute cost, right? And it's just gonna calculate the cost based on the number of units and however much it costs per unit. And notice that's what the label, so that's what's being returned. These are your function procedures being used. The cost is being returned and it prints it, okay? Now let's test it out. I'm using an older version. I hope it works. All right, so I'm just gonna enter values. All right, we have 9 values. We're gonna say Jane Doe. We're gonna say 5 units. We're gonna stay off campus. And now we're gonna select programming as a major, calculate cost. All right, so now we have that cost. All right, so we're gonna clear the form. And before I go and do this, I want to close this just so you can see the text file. So based on our code, let's code here, student cost file. We sent it to the eDrive student cost text. So that's where you will go and find your text file when you're testing it out. So I'm gonna go to my eDrive and look for student cost, which was just generated, open, and notice this is the information that was entered. This is the first person, all right? So that's what's there. So now let's execute it again, and you'll notice now how it adds. So let's put, and then John Doe, 10 units, they're gonna stay on campus. Notice now that the housing pops up. We're gonna select Craig Hall. Their major is technology education, calculate cost, so that's how much they'll have to pay. Let's clear it. And let's just do this. -1 on campus, Julian, sociology, calculate. So notice student ID. I didn't enter enough numbers. So let's make sure we do that. All right, calculate cost. Notice my units is not between 1 and 24. So I need to put the appropriate and calculate cost. So now it gives me my cost, clear the form, close it. Now I'm gonna go back, look for that student cost file again. And notice it has appended all of the people that, so now you have a record of everyone that's registering for the college. And even if you would like for your assignment, I don't know if it's for this week, I'll wait, but just looking at how you can append and create a record of everybody that registered. So notice that gives you an idea of what happens behind the scenes when companies, organizations are using online systems for registration. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful in understanding what you're creating. Good luck this week, and I'll see you guys soon.